time for us to again vanish into our seats in the audience to hear and be in the presence of one of the finest poets in Indian writing today. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Ranjit Hoskote.
The vastness of the stage, but anyway. Thank you all for coming out on a Sunday afternoon, and I'll just start in a moment. Terribly ordered. It's the opposite for me. If I don't have these things all set in place, I'd probably read things backwards. But I thought I'd begin by just dwelling a little bit on the wonderful thoughts and impulses that have been set in play in the course of this festival. And I'm particularly thinking of motifs like the collegiality of poets, and all that we inherit that is really through the oral traditions of different kinds. And just being here over this weekend has reminded me of how powerfully things are transmitted when people meet and talk or receive things, not through the written word and not through institutions, but through just being together and doing things together. So in that spirit, I thought I'd dwell a little bit on how the questions that we get as poets often have to do with very, very basic things. Sometimes we tend to get irritated by those questions, but they remain fundamental. Why poetry? What happened to the music of the kind of poetry we knew? And so on and so forth. I have to say that for me, the beginnings were really in an ethos, a family ethos that was saturated in the arts. So there was never really a point where I felt that the arts were alien to me and I needed to reach out for them. They were around. Some of my earliest memories are musical. And I was just thinking as I was walking here today that these things become earworms. They remain with you forever. This very early memory of my father humming the part in the third movement of Beethoven's Opus 31, Opus 61, the violin concerto. And there are times, even today, when I catch myself just humming that, the la 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 la. And it's just there. It's been with me for 4 decades and longer. On the other hand, there's everything that we inherit from our mothers and our foremothers. And particularly when Savita and Medha were speaking of that, it moved me in a really deep way, because another very early musical memory for me is hearing my mother sing a cheti, and she had a particular fondness for the forms of music that patriarchally and stupidly we classify as semi-classical, or whatever clumsy term is used, the cheti, the tappa, the thumri, women's songs that come out of musical experience. And there again, it's a kind of earworm that remains with me. So suddenly there are moments, the season turns and you find yourself going back to the cheti, and it announces a certain kind of spring. So, and that also set me thinking about a question Malachi asked us when we were on the translation panel yesterday. Why do you write in English? And for Mani and Jerry and me, of course, the answer was simple. It's not so much us choosing a language, but a language choosing us. We are Anglophone poets. But the nature of that Anglophone poetry is deeply nourished by different kinds of languages, musics, visualities. And the act of creating a poem in this language is also the act of dealing with all these different inheritances. So it's not as if the poem is something that just utters itself. It's something that you craft in an artisanal way. So I thought I'd just set some of these thoughts in play, and I will now read a few poems. And I'll read from these 2 earlier books, Vanishing Acts and Central Time, and from a new set of poems. I'm going to open with one called Ghalib in the Winter of the Great Revolt, Delhi, 1857. The emperor's murdered grandsons hang from the gate of peace like hushed bells, and rifles drill the sentenced air. My neighbor, the flautist, slit his veins last night, burning his prayer book before he died, true to a god of subtle tones, wasted on the deaf. Ghalib writes to a friend, all around us the furies ride their burning horses. It's as though Taimur had broken Delhi's walls again, his cinder-streaked soldiers heaping pyramids of skulls in the streets, an abacus for orphans to compute the profits of betrayal, the penalties of defeat. Cannon, the only thunder, writes Ghalib, and no rain. Gunners waving St. George's flag have driven the nobles from their charred mansions, tethered the peasants to the surly river. The coppersmith, tapping at a dead branch, fills the vacant sky with the privacy of his grief. The friend, with a spy at his shoulder, writes back, when did you become a poet of adjectives, roosting in the rafters of a broken house? Ghalib, the owl must hide in the tamarind for now, but the genies of havoc will go on furlough soon. You say your inkwell is empty, but your dry quill still claws at the fibers of the heart. A pharmacist may drug himself with lyric, Ghalib replies, and a tiger may vanish in the rainforest of his hunter's dreams. But the dry quill is a reproach, and this raw winter could be the living tomb of my song. Send paper, friend. These are the last pages of my journal I'm writing on. I turn now to a poem called Mountain, which is set in Dambulla in Sri Lanka, which many of you are doubtless familiar with. It's a Buddhist shrine. And for the longest time, I had a kind of resistance to writing about the places I went to in a life that has involved much travel. But suddenly something broke free here, and I found myself writing about Sri Lanka. It was also a delicate time in the early 2000s. It was very brief, a precarious ceasefire. And we were there, and it's between two rounds of violence in the island. So I think there was a certain attentiveness to place, to people, to the situation. Mountain, Dambulla. Where the rock sags, the ceiling billows like a tent above the sleeping Buddhas. We quit the cave and through a window see a mountain framed against the slow burning sky. Dead wind, a summit floating on cloud. Twilight's secrecies are about to shroud that right-angled sky. They hold back for the instant it takes a langur to look up and blind us with twin setting suns. For 2 seconds, the massive prints itself on every face we see. A waterfall drips out the minutes that remain. An attendant, impatient for prayer or video game, waits for the last reluctant visitors to collect their shoes and leave. He enters the full moon, thumb printed in his log. We turn to check if anything's been left behind and find the peak behind a half-shut door, slipping through which, our feet ready to climb, we stumble down a rock-cut path picked out by glowworms, small ambushes of light. The mountain darkens to a deeper shade of night. And this one is called Landscapes with Saints. My math is terrible, so I have to count the number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 7 brief sections here. This poem emerged, on the one hand, from a profound fascination with our saints, who are eccentric figures. They are flamboyant in their spiritual excess. They have no truck with authority. They are wonderfully mad. And on the other hand, for this poem, there was my fascination with a certain kind of miniature. How do you get a very small space to fit in and encompass the whole world, whole life world. So that was really the formal attempt here. Landscapes with saints. 1. Mean as knives his burnished limbs rotted and stank when the gateman came to call his number. Gorak forgot. His body was just a borrowed suit, one size too large. 2. He's forgotten the river pilot's song. He's above parrot gossip, beyond the hawk's warning cry, wrapping himself in the torn fabric of sky. Kabir climbs on. 3. Dropping his nimbus in the grass, he looks at the boats riding the stream below, close enough to touch. When the road ends, Tukka takes a deep breath and leaps. 4. She sees a boatman rowing in sand, shielding his skiff from the ocean's roar. Such a safe harbor, brother, sings Lala. It saves you the trouble of charting your course. 5. His eyes would not rest on a quatrain of walls and scanned the desert air instead. Mango trees balancing on their heads. Himself, Khushru, a bird of paradise judged by earth. Neglect leafs through his pages, perfumes escape from files left unstoppered on his shelves. Lead crumbles in Attar's mind, his hands, wherever they rest, touch gold. A torn cotton robe against the wind, his limbs nettle-pricked, transparent as prayers. His name burnt out, Milarepa sings to himself as he travels the centuries. Long years as a cultural organizer have made me, a victim of looking at the watch all the time and saying, how much time does this guy on stage have? But there's someone else to do that, right? Okay, good. This one's called Fugue. And again speaks to both the musical idea of the fugue as a certain kind of composition and the sadder kind of fugue, which is just a gapping out of memory. And I think as poets, we have many fears as poets, but among the greatest fears is the loss of language. And I shouldn't be grinning when I say that, because we've seen people in that situation and it has been exceedingly tragic. So Fugue is a poem that looks at that kind of situation through the medium that we have, which is language. Roots, coracle, oracle, a dry pasture, goats, oatmeal, bridge, or ridge, or turnip, urn, lip, loose, use. Marvelous, isn't it, the way words unravel? Tin man and lion man, airstrip, straight, lateen sail, dow, skein from skein, thread, unknotting from thread, fissile articles, missiles, parts of speech, neem leaves in an amber jar in the kitchen. Or vinegar. What am I smelling between each syllable? Parsley, thyme, Simon and Garfunkel? Olive oil, foil for the oven, cinnamon, carrots, fingers around a candle. Candelabra. The skeins keep branching, raveling, unraveling. Same thing, isn't it? Drawing further and further from what I meant. Gap, autocorrect, alter, control, delete, table of contents, right click, wiped clean, tabula rasa. You were saying? I think poetry also for many of us is a way of retrieving place. It's about thinking back to all the confluences that go into the nourishing of these individual selves, which is why I have a very deep dislike of the ready-made boxes of identity into which people like to slot other people. And if there's one thing that poetry helps you to do, it's to dismantle those ready-made boxes of identity. It allows you to embrace all the various strangenesses that go into what you believe is familiar. For me also, with my particular diasporic history, it's a way of reaching out to places and people and histories and narratives that are now at some distance. So I'm going to read a few poems that address this attempt to reach out to memories of different kinds. This one's called Reading a Script at Ziyarat Dastgir Sobon, Srinagar, 2005. It's, some of you are probably familiar with this very beautiful Reshi shrine. It's a Sufi shrine in Srinagar. It unfortunately burnt down some years ago, or was burnt down, and has now been restored, but not to its former glory. Reading a Script at Ziyarat Dastgir Sobon. Proverbs fall from the saint's upturned bowl. Beneath the cypress, work is a steel-gray word. Thought is plum and prayer a mournful green. A cube with 3 lacquered walls and a broken face holds them together. The almond merchant shuffles past the lake without humming. The singer hides his voice under a scarf. The guide won't admit to his compass. They're actors in a long-running movie about comets in which a pair of hands wash themselves at a fountain over and over, the soundtrack worn out, silence dripping from the stripped chinar and the charred roof to the headstones buried in snow. And from the mountains to the coast, which effectively was the journey my ancestors took and which I took in turn, because I spent some of my early childhood in Goa. And each time I go back, I have this terrible sense of the memory of how it used to be in the early 70s and what it is now. So that informs this poem, which is called The Myth of Eternal Return. And it goes like this. The Myth of Eternal Return, Vatorda, Goa. You leave the megaphone on the beach and nature to its own devices. Tread sand, paddle across clumped seaweed, and speak to the road watched by latticed eyes. Palm green is the color of asylum here, and sleep comes quickly in its shade. Here's where you rest from the water that burnt your hands at noon. But rest is hard work. Every turn seems wrong. And where the chapel stood, a rusting sentry points to a lane that climbs among houses and no hill. Your words grow lean and spare when breath is crafting ways to temper a slope. The croton leaves that speckled the wall are ash, but the east windows still give on the bamboo grove. Trying the gate, you look along the leaf-swept drive. The woman bending over Caesar's grave is the girl who raced you up the hill. She won, you fell, and have a scar on the forehead to prove it. You wait for her to turn. It's me, you say, after all these years. Pray do not be alarmed. I'm not going to read all of these. You won't need to flash another. Okay, this one's called, I'm going to read some new poems in conclusion. Let me begin with one called Night Sky and Counting. It came out of a conversation with the novelist and photographer Teju Cole, and we were talking about an artwork that reminds us very, very powerfully of the situation of surveillance in which we all live. As Luckily, I have an antique Nokia, so I might be off the radar, but all of you with smartphones are being surveilled as you sit here. So, Night Sky and Counting for Teju Cole. You are in the dark, looking up at constellations and shooting stars, finding traces of adobe roofs and walls at the eye's radium rim while grass tickles your back. You notice some celestial objects move faster than others. You are the samurai of wide-open spaces. They scan you in their eyes. You're a ninja, betrayed by body heat. You're that gray, glowing to orange smear in minutes you could evaporate, leaving heat shadow printed on the ground to mark the spot. You thought you were the subject, the locus of consciousness. When the shooting stars look down, they see an object with eyes, a moving threat under the black mirror at which you point to finger-link faint trails that might be a hunter, his belt, his faithful dogs, or a raven, a boar, a river of eyes. You have no cover. You are in the dark. Less sinister, a poem called Open for Business. I seem to write a number of poems that have to do with waiting in cafes for friends. Friends who appear not to consult their watches or their phones for time, but who's complaining. Open for business. Newspaper bunched in hand, you're misting the door with Lysol, wiping the glass panels in wide arcs. But the man in the blue paisley bandana who's whistling the opening bars of How Saiba Poltori Voita isn't planning to get scrubbed off the menu. He's pushing through with a crate of eggs, his hands itching for whisk and skillet, the first Spanish omelette of the day. He's a dancer, sweet-talking the boatman into getting her across the river. You're a tightrope walker with a limp, nursing a sore throat. You spray the swinging air with soap. My Jerry Pinto moment when I'm looking among these poems and hoping to find something to read. Oh, where are we? Okay. How are we doing? Okay, fabulous. Okay. This one's called The Atlas of Lost Beliefs. Without waking up, turn to page 37 in the Atlas of Lost Beliefs and surround yourself with apsaras, kinnaras, gandharvas, maenads, satyrs, sorcerers, bonobos, organ grinders, stargazers, gunsmiths, long-distance runners, gravediggers, calligraphers, solitary reapers, bean cars, troubadours, rababias, ronin, nagas, pearl divers, vandals, goths, mummers, snipers, collectors of moths, hobos, dharma bums, bowls, drifters, jinns, mahjubs, marabouts, kalandars, griots, mad hatters, speakers in tongues, trippers, star angels, batmen, punks, eggheads, buffoons, lay preachers, agitators, friends of the court, friars minorite, agents, provocateurs, bird-spangled shamans, fainting oracles, screeching owls, wise men of Gotham, and women who run with wolves, all blessed by the blue hand of a reckless dancer who spares a thought or two for the world, but no more, as she poses, heels in the air, Cossack kicking on a crumbling reef. And I'll close with a poem called Highway Prayer. If you're writing a fresh anthem for the one scorched island marooned in cyclone country, Be sure to put in a line about burnt tires and sleeping dogs, and another line on the flags, curtains, TV screens, more flags, all the shrouds the islanders are hanging up to protect themselves from the world. They need a savior. That'll be the man in the red raincoat falling through an open door. An unseen hand stops him, props him up. He blocks the door, a crucifix barring the passage of time. Time burns right through him. He clutches at his burst stomach, crouching on the sidewalk, holding fast to the creased memory of a river he loved. In him the shimmer is great, greater than panic, greater than the fear of flies, of stakes, of exploding shells, of ending up as roadkill. Tongue-tied, he reads this Rosetta of violence, this highway across which sirens call to knotted prophets, Batmen to jokers, jets to sharks. Bless me, ivories, this land, pirate says, at last shiver me timbers, in this place that found me empty, in this place that found me parched. I am blood, I am grief, I am the returning rocket, I am contrary to the Commonwealth. Lord of the booming antlers on a yellow signboard, let go, he calls, let go. Craft me into this totality that never closes. Thank you for your attention.
Took us in the past few minutes to a completely different universe. And if this is the outcome of spending time in a cafe waiting for friends, we should be in cafes more often, Amita.
Absolutely. In fact, Vasanthi, one thing I kind of noticed with Ranjit, his ability to use the most diverse words and his ability to thread together each one of them completely disconnected and give them meaning. It's wonderful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Let's hear it for Ranjit Hoskote.
Also, ladies and gentlemen, Ranjit will be available for book signing
Yeah.
outside, so please head over there and remember to take selfies.